Right, so producer surplus is similar to consumer surplus. It could be considered to be the opposite because we're talking about producers and we use a supply curve, whereas consumer surplus is consumers and the demand curve. But it's the same kind of thing where you will get it in multiple choice questions and it could be part of your answer to an essay question. So for example, there might be a question about a policy and they're asking you what is going to be the effect on producers. So definition: the difference between the price producers are prepared to pay, prepared to accept, and the price they receive. So what you have to think about here is the producer has perhaps produced some products and it's cost them maybe £4 a unit to produce, and therefore they feel like they need to make a little bit of profit. So perhaps the lowest they're prepared to accept is maybe £5. If they're not going to get £5, then it's not really worth it. If they get any more than £5, then that's a bonus, and that would be their producer surplus. So in this case, we're saying they're prepared to accept £5 for a scarf. That's the minimum, otherwise it's not worth their while. They're able to sell it for £7, so that means the producer surplus is £2. If they're able to now get £8 and they're prepared to accept £5, producer surplus is going to increase to £3. So just as with consumer surplus, we're going to look at a diagram. So producer surplus is a shaded triangle. So just to remind you, I'm just going to draw a consumer surplus diagram at the top. So remember, consumer surplus diagram was with the demand curve. We drew the price and we drew the triangle at the top. Producer surplus is the opposite. It's a supply curve and you draw your price on and you shade below the price. So producer surplus is below the price, consumer surplus is above the price. Now, this is going to be a triangle if your supply curve hits the price axes. If your supply curve is drawn like this, so that it hits the quantity axes, then what you're going to find is that your producer surplus is actually going to be a trapezium. So don't be alarmed if you get a trapezium, that's totally fine. Consumer surplus is always going to be a triangle, but producer surplus could be a triangle, could be a trapezium, depending upon how you've drawn your supply curve. Right, so just as we did with consumer surplus, we're going to have a look at producer surplus and what happens to producer surplus when the price changes. So we'll have our supply curve, price and quantity, because remember we always have to label everything. So our producer surplus, when price is P1, is going to be the blue area. We're going to increase the price. And when we increase the price, the producer surplus is the red area. So what you can see is the change in producer surplus. We go from blue to red. The change is the yellow, and that is an increase in producer surplus. If the price had fallen, it would be a decrease in producer surplus. So what you have to remember is if the price increases, that's good for the producer. The producer is getting more money for their product. That's an increase in producer surplus. Now if we have a look at the diagrams when you've got a demand curve on there and a supply curve, this is where it starts to get confusing again. So the first diagram, they've actually done a reduction in price. So the first diagram, supply shifts from S1 to S2. So our original producer surplus, our price is going to be A. So our original producer surplus is going to be the blue area. So it's the area below the price, but kind of above the supply curve. Our supply curve now shifts to S2. So our price has fallen to F. So now what we need to do, probably want to draw that in, is shade this area. So that is our new producer surplus. So that's a little bit confusing, but you can probably see that it's slightly bigger. On the other diagram, we've gone from D1 to D2. So when we're originally starting from here, we're shading, that's our original producer surplus. And then what's happened, we've got our new demand curve and our new producer surplus is that triangle. And then our change in producer surplus we can easily identify. We can't really identify the change in producer surplus on the first diagram because there's too many overlapping bits. It's a bit confusing. So our change in producer surplus is that yellow area. And here's a final diagram showing consumer and producer surplus on the same diagram. So your consumer surplus is the top bit, your producer surplus is the bottom bit. And if you were to shift the supply or the demand curve, then you're going to be changing your consumer and producer surplus areas.